you might ask yourself, what do these gestures mean? What does that peace sign mean? Or the hook 'em horns, or a heart, or a thumbs up? Do they have cross-cultural meaning? I think as technology and media bring us more and more together, we are coming to places where they have more and more shared meaning. But certainly in the past, a gesture made in Japan didn't necessarily mean the same thing that it did in the United States. And of course, finally, language. Language can actually include the verbal component, the words we use, which includes what we would refer to as paralinguistics, like our tone and vocal inflections, as well as the visual component, the gestures and expressions and written text. So language can be communicated via the word on a page, or language can be communicated to you through spoken word or visual gestures, but we also have to be able to interpret mood when we're talking about language. We know that about 50, maybe 60% of communication is nonverbal communication. So that leaves about 45% that's verbal communication. We just have to be very aware of the emotional cues that we're using when we're communicating. Language is extremely important. It's so important that many have argued that it shapes not only our communication, but our perceptions and how we see things in the world itself. This is referred as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the idea that language structures thought and that ways of looking at the world are embedded in language. That's essentially the premise that this hypothesis is based on, that the ideal, our thoughts, communicated through language, structures the way the material, i.e., the stuff out there in the world, takes shape. Culture also is described in reference to the values and the norms of our society. Values, which are shared beliefs about what a group considers worthwhile or desirable. And of course, they guide the creation of norms. Norms are the rules regarding what kind of values or behaviors are acceptable and appropriate within a culture. A value is that we don't believe in killing people. A norm is the rules that govern us in reference to whether we do kill someone, or rules that exist out there to prevent us from killing somebody. Norms, of course, are specific to a culture, a time period, and a situation. And they can be either formal, such as a law, or the rules for playing soccer, or they could be informal, such as something that's not written down and unspoken. It's an informal rule to not pass gas in a public space. There's no formal rule, but if you do it, you might get some responses from people indicating that what you did was inappropriate. Types of norms can be distinguished by the strictness with which they are enforced. As I said earlier, if you're in an elevator, there are certain behaviors that you can express and certain behaviors that you can't. I mentioned passing gas, but there's also some other informal rules that govern behavior. If you just turn around and start staring at somebody in the elevator, you can make somebody feel very uncomfortable. You can tell that because the person steps aside when you stare at them, or they get off of the elevator when you made them feel uncomfortable. This is you violating a norm, and that norm is going to create a behavioral response from the person in the elevator. Some types of norms. Folkways. Folkways include things like using the correct fork for eating a salad, coming to class prepared. These are loosely enforced norms that involve common customs, practices, or procedures that ensure smooth social interaction and acceptance. A more, on the other hand, is a norm that carries a moral significance. Mores include things that society values as significantly important. You can think of the word morals to help remind you of this concept. For instance, there are mores against lying, cheating, and similar acts. These are closely related to the core values of a group and often involve severe repercussions for violators. And of course, there's the taboo and norm ingrained so deeply that even thinking about violating it evokes strong feelings of disgust, horror, or revulsion for most people. Incest is one of these in our society. These norms are then controlled by sanctions. Sanctions are positive or negative reactions to the ways that people follow or disobey norms, including rewards for conformity and punishment for norm violators. Sanctions help establish social control. The formal and the informal mechanisms essentially used to increase conformity to values and norms and thus increase social cohesion. So we need to have our sanctions in line with the infractions, because if, for example, you have a rule that says you cannot cross the street any place other than a crosswalk. And if someone crosses the street someplace other than a crosswalk, i.e. what we would refer to as jaywalking, they get snagged up by the police and put to death. Those are sanctions that are not in line with the infraction. And you will lose social control if the sanctions don't line up with the actual things a person in society is doing wrong. We also have to keep in mind variations in culture. Multiculturalism is essentially values that diverse racial, ethnic, national, and linguistic backgrounds exist, and therefore we encourage the retention of cultural differences within society rather than assimilation. The United States has existed as an assimilation nation most of its history, with respect to cultures coming and migrating into our population. But at the same time, in the United States, we've had a very strong push to retain the diverse racial, ethnic, and national identities of those that come to our country. Um, Another important concept is the dominant culture, which refers to the values, norms, and practices of the group within society that is most powerful in terms of wealth, prestige, status, and influence. In the United States, this is the white Anglo Saxon Protestant population. Um, if you look at who possesses the power in the United States, they are usually white, they are usually Anglo. Um, they are not always Protestant, but if religious, they probably err on the side of Protestantism. And they're also, they tend to be male. That is the group that creates all of the cultural norms in the United States that are then passed on for us to assimilate into our behavior. There's also, of course, subcultures. These are groups within society that are differentiated by their distinctive values, norms, and lifestyles. One of the subcultures that is no longer as subculture as it has been historically is those of the LBGTQ community, those that defined their sexual identity in ways that are different than the dominant culture. And I say they're not as much of a subculture. Do not get me wrong. They are still experiencing a lot of cultural pushback about, especially in reference to how they define themselves. But they also are able to define themselves in ways that they have not been able to in the past. Another important concept is a counterculture. This is a group within society that openly rejects and may actually oppose society's values and norms. A good example of this is white nationalists. They don't accept the idea that the United States is a multicultural society that appreciates its diversity and sees people that don't look like them as equals. And they reject any of those ideas within their social landscape. And of course, we need to think about cultural change. Cultures usually change slowly and incrementally, though change can also happen in rapid and dramatic ways. Rapid change is hard for a large population to process smoothly. But sometimes it happens, and at times a subculture can influence the mainstream and become part of a dominant culture, or something that is dominant can change to a counterculture. So things can change over time. We could think about racism. Racism in the United States was one time part of the dominant rhetoric in our culture, and it was seen as very mainstream. Now, it might be coming back right now, but in the United States, it is now seen as a subculture, and it is not part of the dominant culture in the United States.